We are March 3rd, 2025, and it's 1:42 p.m. in New York, and time for another Energy Vista podcast. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. Today, I'm joined with Phil Chaffee, the editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly at Energy Intelligence, who has been reporting on everything related to nuclear energy since 2006. We're going to discuss the revival of nuclear energy in the US and around the world and the geopolitics of the supply chain, among other things. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me on the Energy Vista podcast. And actually, it brings me back old memories because you were my first neighbor, like in a work office environment, my first cubicle neighbor.
Indeed, when we were little babies, reporting on the energy world.
Exactly. And I remember, so I think you joined 1 year before me in 2006. I joined in 2007. But around that time, maybe 1 year or 2 years later, we were already discussing nuclear revival. You were writing about it, 2008, 2010, 2009. And then the Great Fukushima disaster happened.
Indeed.
Also, I think there was the shale gas revolution that was starting to impact natural gas prices, making it natural gas, much more competitive. So all this was happening, but now fast forward almost more than 15 years later, we're talking again about nuclear renaissance. So can you explain us this time around, like what are the main drivers? Everybody's talking a lot about AI, the data centers, the tech companies driving basically this renaissance. But from your point of view, what is going to be different this time around?
I mean, we'll see if it's different. I think outside of China and a couple other places where they are really building reactors fast, right now we're still a provisional new renaissance where there's a lot of plans almost everywhere in the world to build a lot of nuclear, but there's still not a lot of concrete being poured yet. So the sort of the pieces are lining up. It's not fully there. As to the drivers, some of them are very similar to the drivers 20 years ago. It's climate change and just this idea that you need low carbon or zero carbon power. The slight difference, I would say, is I mean, you do have, I wouldn't say it's primarily AI companies and those as drivers. They have signed some very noticeable and notable deals, such as last September, the Microsoft deal to turn back on Constellation's plant 3 Mile Island, one of the units there, to turn that on after that was shuttered several years ago. And that plus some other big news has sort of got a lot of coverage. I think the bigger driver is policy across Europe, across a lot of U.S. states, the U.S. government, and Canada, and that is again climate change and people thinking about deploying clean power. Particularly, I think, in Europe. But also this idea that as grids have become more renewables heavy, having firm, clean, having baseload power there is key. And in the short term, as I'm sure you're aware, short to midterm, gas is the big solution there.
Right. So do you see like a competition in the medium longer term between gas and nuclear? Because right now gas seems to be the readily commercial available added supply needed for data center. The time that it will take to build nuclear reactors, new ones, small ones, big ones, what is it, like 10 years,
At a
15 years?
minimum, generally,
Yeah.
you're generally talking 10. I mean, there are there are a lot of small companies and big companies claiming that you can do it in much faster time periods. That has not been proved. So yeah, you're talking about a very different period of time, and yeah, probably in the mid 2030s and 2040, you it is much more a competition where if renewables really do get deployed at scale, particularly in North America and Europe, what they will ultimately be displacing is gas. In Asia, probably less competition, just because the big thing that everyone's focused on displacing there is coal, and you can displace it with either.
Mhm. Okay.
Southeast
So you
Asia.
mentioned, yeah, you mentioned policy. Would you say that in the US it's a bipartisan support for nuclear? The Secretary Chris Wright seems pretty supportive of the nuclear industry. What is this current administration going to do to further encourage growth of the nuclear power plants in the US?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's bipartisan in the U.S. and sort of everywhere. I mean, one of nuclear's uh, superpowers in terms of surviving policy shifts at this point is the generally the left. There are some key exceptions here, but generally the left has basically come on board to nuclear as a climate solution. So it can be viewed as like a low carbon solution, and that's certainly how the Biden administration viewed it in the U.S. On the other side, a lot of the governments that are most excited about nuclear are fairly right wing. And in Europe, maybe they talk about low carbon, but they much more talk about energy security and having uh, baseload power that doesn't need any imports. I mean, we can get to the nuclear fuel, but it's much more secure and much more price secure in terms of the fuel inputs than other things. There's one final layer on nuclear, which is uh, there's this status thing with nuclear, both just having the technology because it is very advanced, but also and then some countries there are these links, particularly once you're building out domestic nuclear fuel cycle, that then has weapons links potentially too. But I mean that is a different thing. But these are three big drivers that basically allow nuclear to survive transitions as we've seen in the U.S. In terms of what will happen in the U.S., it's interesting because the industry, the signals that Trump and Wright and everyone else give are very positive in the Trump administration to nuclear. At the same time, they are talking about dismantling a lot of the big regulatory subsidies and structures that the Biden administration put up. So the IRA and other things had a lot of money, investment tax credits, production tax credits, um, huge amounts of funding on R&D, on sort of deploying first of a kind reactors, and all of that, there's a bit of a question mark there. I mean, the Trump administration and the Republican Congress are very clearly going to dismantle a lot of it. Um, but will there still be money left? Presumably, they're going to carve out. I mean, sort of the industry is banking on the idea that they are going to carve out the subsidies and potentially leave funding in the DOE Loan Programs Office, which has hundreds of billions of funding, and
Yeah.
leave that for nuclear, but it's still to be proven that that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's an industry where I don't think it can really succeed without a good private-public partnership. Like if it's not subsidies or some kind of grants for research. I mean, you see it in countries around the world. I mean, there are not that many, you know, countries that have good strategy for nuclear, but the ones that have, often it's state-owned companies. You know, Rosatom for Russia. France is trying now to come back a little bit with like the spin-off of Areva, Aramco, or
No, so
yes,
France is it's led by EDF.
EDF,
EDF
yes,
is the one that will the big utility in France that already has
which is also partly state-owned,
which is fully state owned,
fully state-owned now. Yeah,
and they want to deploy more. Yes, you're fully right. Basically, almost everywhere. I think basically everywhere. Well, no, okay, there are exceptions here. Almost everywhere the nuclear has been built, it has been built by state-owned companies. In the places where it hasn't, Japan or back in the '70s, a lot of the American utilities, they often have some sort of monopoly or regulated aspect where they're able to take on the costs of the nuclear construction. But and even without that, they are also responding to other various government incentives. So there's almost no scenario where at least large reactors are even being conceived of in a fully private context without any government subsidies or anything.
right. So the US doesn't have any national champions, right? Like on the nuclear side, in terms of yeah.
Not quite. There are a couple. I mean, the big one is TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which came out of the New Deal, the FDR programs in the 1930s, and that does remain basically it has a very weird status, but it is basically a state-owned entity with a particular mission. But they are the exception to the rule. Generally, in the US, you have utilities and the two big kinds, or you have the ones in the regulated markets where they can uh, get ratepayer recovery via state utility boards generally, or the ones in the merchant markets where they much more compete on the ups and downs of the power markets.
One of the driver behind this search for a more secure and resilient supply chain for nuclear fuel and refining, I mean not refining, enrichment and so on. Do you see also do you see it also motivated by nuclear purposes? Because we know there are some kind of bridges, right, between the civil and the military nuclear programs. Or
Uh-huh.
for the US, do you think that if the US gets a more secure, resilient supply chain for its civil program, does it also make it more secure for the military program?
A bit. So that's an interesting overlap. The issue for nuclear fuel generally, for basically 90% of the reactors out there, you need enriched uranium in the fuel. The exception here is the heavy water reactors that the Canadians developed, and those are also in India. But for 90% of the reactors, you need enriched uranium, so you can't just dig up the uranium and put it in a reactor. You've got to convert it to gas and then enrich it. And it's that enrichment process that's just very sensitive because you enrich it to under 5% generally for the existing nuclear fleet. But if you just keep on enriching it, keep spinning those centrifuges, it can go up to I mean, near 100%, and that's where you get the very weapons grade material. So, having domestic enriching capability that could potentially go either way um, is potentially key. In the US, there has not been domestically a domestic enrichment program with domestic IP for basically over a decade. There is one U.S. enrichment plant, commercial U.S. enrichment plant in New Mexico, but that's owned by Urenco, a European company, a consortium of German, Dutch, and British, and it uses centrifuges that are also developed together with the French. There are a lot of plans to build out and develop new enrichment capacities in the U.S. There's a huge several billion dollars of money that the DOE has to parcel out to try to encourage this. And theoretically, some of the indigenous ones, if they go forward commercially, they could ultimately then supply some of the military means. At this point, we're not talking bombs, but the bigger issue in the US is long term having enough high enriched uranium for its submarine fleet. Still ultimately for military purposes. We have more than enough material, and basically there's been outside of the five official weapon states, there has not been. Uh, I guess there's some question marks here, but there's basically been an informal ban on producing new material for weapons, um, meaning high enriched uranium or plutonium.
Mm. So I don't think many people know that, but I was reading. I think Russia is supplying to the US about 27% of its enriched uranium.
So it was.
Was okay.
um, uh, Basically 20%, depending on the year. It was supplying a lot of enriched material and and actually less the uranium than the enrichment, and they would basically supply the enriched uranium and take back uranium. So they would be supplying the enrichment. Russia has this huge capacity of these Soviet-built enrichment plants out in Siberia with this just enormous capacities that have rarely been used entirely. I mean, they've rarely produced at capacity. Um, since February 2022, um, there has been increasingly a block away from that. This past summer, the U.S. Congress passed a full ban, which fully goes into effect on importing Russian low-enriched uranium. That fully goes into effect in 2028, and right now there's this process of granting waivers to that. So some material can come in, but it has to be, you have to go through a long process and explain why you need the material, and it's sort of every shipment needs to get this waiver. Um, this has radically changed the fuel market because it means that long term, if Russian supply is not coming in, that makes a bigger case for expanded enrichment production, or enrichment capacity in Europe and the US. Obviously, there's huge question marks here. If somehow a Russia Ukraine peace deal is
I was
struck,
going to say if we're back to a reset between Russia and the US or some kind
right? And
of closure.
obviously, I mean, we can. Who knows what happens there? But in a world where Washington and Moscow fully want to renormalize relationships, that could upend a lot of this effort to try to develop new capacities in the U.S. There's also Urenco, who I talked about, and also you mentioned before the Orano state-owned nuclear, the French state-owned nuclear company called Orano. They also are building out their capacities at a plant in southern France, and then Urenco is building out their capacities at their European plants in the three countries I
Mhm.
mentioned.
Has Russia ever weaponized its exports of enriched uranium or building facilities of nuclear plants, out in
What do you
the
mean?
emerging
What do you
world?
mean weaponized? Sorry.
When using it for political purposes, geopolitical purposes, for its.
Um, I think the big thing they've done is they are much better because all of the Russian fuel is all part of one big company, Rosatom, which is state owned. They own all of the Russian nuclear plants, but they also are the ones who sell these projects and sell reactor exports globally. In Turkey, they own the plant that they're building, the four reactors in Turkey. But beyond that, they often pair those deals with very long term fuel supply deals, and that is where the sort of, I wouldn't say weaponizing, but the offering. I think, and often they also will offer to take back the spent fuel. So it's yeah, it's a much more sort of comprehensive offer with potentially buried subsidies. It's hard to, they can potentially take a loss in one segment of that to guarantee other parts of that. But again, it's hard to exactly know, project by project how they're doing that. But yeah, they have been aggressive. And then prior to February 2022, they separately had fuel supply to a lot of Europe, to the U.S., separate from the reactor supplies. But
Right.
it's been
So,
pulled
like
back.
this new strategy since February 2022 was to become less dependent on the Russian products, including enriched uranium. Was it also like a kind of sanctions, economic sanctions? We give you less revenues as a retaliation for what
Absolutely,
the
absolutely.
invasion of Ukraine. But before that time, there was no fear of Russia basically curtailing those exports.
No, and I think a couple months ago, the Kremlin did finally come out and say they would also potentially ban exports of enriched uranium to the US. This was much more retaliatory based on the US ban. Prior to that, Rosatom had always been very clear that they are a solid supplier. I mean, they've made this case in the gas markets too, that they would never cut off.
Well, they did it on the gas side,
They
Gazprom did.
did, but yeah, but I mean, they were sort of,
Yeah,
their
yeah.
mantra was that we'll never cut off for political reasons.
Okay. So, like right now, the Trump administration is going to try to develop a new strategy to become more resilient in terms of the imports of enriched uranium coming more from friendly allies. Like, what's going to be the strategy?
I don't think they have articulated that. The again, because so much is caught up in what is happening in terms of the relationship with Moscow and what happens with Ukraine, I don't think they have articulated any different strategy that was deployed by the Biden administration. And what was deployed under the Biden administration was both this ban that I've talked about, and these pots of money, several $billion, to build out enrichment capacities and uranium conversion capacities. Sorry, mainly enrichment capacities in the U.S. So I don't think anybody expects the Trump administration to pull that stuff back. But again, who knows what happens if they do normalize relationship with Russia? Presumably they're going to drop this ban, but then you need Congress to do that. So it's unclear. I don't, but the Trump administration is still way too young to have articulated any real policies on this particular issue. They have talked about increasing uranium mining and sort of maybe making it a critical mineral, but in terms of actual mining, U.S. uranium has always, I mean, not always, but for the past decades, has been a tiny fraction of the global uranium, and that's not the sort of the big issue. Australia has tons, Canada has tons, Kazakhstan has the most, and that material, yeah, that's it, there aren't the sort of securities concerns that there are in that regard as much as there are in terms of uranium conversion and particularly enrichment.
Okay. Now turning quickly to Europe, also after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Europe kind of realized, oh, maybe we, especially Germany, we phased out too fast nuclear. Do you think there could be a comeback to nuclear in Germany, or it's too late? I actually, a few days ago, I saw a big report in the French magazine talking about Fessenheim, which was one of the oldest French nuclear plants, and how it was a political disaster to have closed it too early because it could have been, the lifetime of the plan could have been extended, and that it was like a political, play at the end. But do you think Europe is changing its mind also about nuclear big time and realizing that they will need this baseload energy?
In a lot of places, yes. I think the most dramatic example was Belgium, where in December of 2021, this is now the previous government came in and said, we are going to fully. I mean, Belgium is talking about phasing out their reactors since 2003, I think, and at the beginning of 2000. At the end of 2021, that government, this was now the one previous government, said we are going to definitely do that by 2025. And then 2 months later, the invasion happened. And a month later, they fully reversed course. This was a coalition government where the energy minister was actually a Green. And they announced, and they then worked towards this deal to extend the two youngest reactors to 2035. Now there's a new government that's even talking about further reactors, keeping them going, and even building new reactors. So that is like the most dramatic one. You've seen swings in Sweden, you've seen swings in the Netherlands, where suddenly everyone's talking about building new reactors. Germany, I'm a bit skeptical. Merz, the likely incoming prime minister.
Chancellor, yeah.
So say again.
No, Chancellor, yeah.
Yeah, or chancellor. He he has sort of mooted the idea of turning on one or two of the reactors. They fully shut their reactors. They actually extended them a couple months after the Ukraine invasion because they were due to shut down
Right,
immediately.
I
They
remember
pushed them
that,
back.
yeah.
They pushed them back a couple months. They have turned them off. He's mooted the idea of potentially turning some of those back on, and it's possible. But if you sort of look at how the mechanics of what his coalition might be, there's a high chance that he'll have to go in with the Greens or others. There's a lot of institutional pushback. I think the utilities that had operated these reactors have fully written them off at this point. So it would be a sort of shift in mindset for them to extend that or to go back and turn them back on, rehire their workforce, find that expertise again. And even in Belgium, where NG previously I won't go through all the iterations of Engie, but they are still the operator of the reactors in Belgium, and for decades after 2003, they had pushed to extend these reactors. But at a certain point, they did do the same thing, and they signed off. They wrote these all down. They just shifted how they thought about nuclear, and they thought we are now going to think about gas and renewables. Nuclear is not really in our wheelhouse anymore, and therefore, to keep those going, they actually negotiated with the Belgian government and got basically a lot of subsidies to keep these two reactors going. So you'd have to have probably the same thing happen in Germany. And is a coalition in Germany, even if they somehow agree on maybe we'll turn on one or two reactors, will they also agree to billions in subsidies to turn them back on? It seems unlikely to me, but who knows?
Okay. And China, we haven't talked about China. Anything interesting happening around the nuclear? Yeah.
China is where there really is a renaissance, and it has been happening. There was basically a pause with a couple exceptions after Fukushima of 5 or 6 years, as sort of at the top echelons of the Chinese party. They thought through the safety, they thought through where to site things. But for the past 3 or 4 years, they have been approving. I mean, their goal is to approve up to 10 new reactors a year, which is up to like 10 gigawatts a year, which is a fair amount. And they are not quite going that fast, but they are going very fast. There's dozens of reactors under construction all over the country. I guess the big shift that happened after Fukushima from them was they had planned to have on inland sites with rivers as cooling water, and that has not happened. It remains just coastal, where they're actually building and deploying reactors, but they are still doing that at pace. What we have not really
Their motivation is to supply the fuel for DeepSeek and their brothers, or like
yeah,
to replace, would it replace coal in China? What is going to happen with it? I mean, it seems like a huge amount of capacity that will come online, what, in 10 years from now?
I mean, there is already a
Yeah,
huge
already, yeah.
capacity, and probably by the end of the decade, they will have, in absolute terms, the the most number of reactors operating in the world, overtaking the U.S. I think they've just overtaken France. Their motivation, I think, they are almost entirely focused, with a couple exceptions again, on just the grid and on producing that baseload power. It's very hard to know looking at China, because they've been increasing on everything, right? They've been increasing their amount of nuclear, they've been increasing their amount of renewables, increasing their
Natural gas production.
and they've been increasing their coal production, right? Their coal plants burning coal. So it's very hard to know for China where at what point they start to think one source is going, or start to decide that one source is going to replace another. I think very long term, they do want to phase out coal, but it's not happening yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a smart strategy. You pursue everything you can do. And I mean, you don't pick and choose one energy as a winner. You actually endorse all of them, and you'll see.
Although you probably don't want to build out tons of coal plants for the environment's sake.
Sure. That's true. Yeah, they restarted building coal plants, right? Like they had said that they would, stop doing that, but they are still providing money for those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So let's move to your personal trajectory, Phil. You've been at Energy Intelligence for almost 20 years. Um, it means you're very happy, I guess, and you managed to grow. I mean, you become an editor, and I think actually, I know other people that have been staying for a very long time for the same company. I mean, we tend to think that our generation is less loyal than the previous generation of our parents, but I think it's more diverse, and that we want to think. So, tell me a little bit. I mean, your choice about staying for the same company versus moving to another company to get another title, to get a higher salary or other opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess sort of fell into it. I'm not sure if I would call it a super active choice. I have been at this company for coming up on 2 decades. I I have had some career growth. I started as just the reporting on nuclear fuel, and then I became a deputy editor and an editor. I've also been the London bureau chief and now the New York bureau chief, and the company has moved me back and forth from London to New York a couple of times. Will happen again. In terms of why, I mean, partly it's when you find a nice company and they're nice to you. I don't see a huge problem in sticking. In terms of, I mean, the energy industry is pretty small. The nuclear industry, the people reporting on it, it's a very, very small, vanishingly small thing. So, to the extent to which I ever wanted to stay on that, there's not a lot of other jobs out there to cover the nuclear industry. I guess one of the reasons I've enjoyed it, and I do enjoy it, is it is so broad. It's global. Um, I am never just thinking about one region. I'm never just thinking about politics. I'm also thinking about uranium markets um, or non-proliferation. I'm thinking, we also cover the Iran talks and talking to people in at the IAEA in Vienna about various diplomatic issues or environmental things. I mean, it's because nuclear can involve all of that stuff and is so global. I'm rarely writing about the same thing one week to the
Right.
next.
Yeah, I've been feeling the same for natural gas, LNG. It's a global market, and it's at the intersection of so many disciplines, right? For you, the same, like
Yeah,
some engineering, financing,
exactly.
policy, geopolitics. Yeah, yeah, never the same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is very attractive, and it's enough to sort of, or financing. And I've talked to bankers about how you structure. I mean, I'm sure you've done the same. How you structure huge, tens of billion-dollar infrastructure projects, and yeah, so I love how varied that can be. I also love traveling, and this job has taken me really all over the world, from uranium mines in Kazakhstan and northern Australia and Namibia to nuclear fuel
Mhm.
plants and nuclear plants in France and the UK and elsewhere. So, and then obviously all of the various conferences we all go to. So,
Mhm.
yeah, it's I suppose I could be more ambitious, like much in our generation, and be popping around through different jobs. But there is
I
there
mean,
has been something.
I don't think that's an obligation. I think it's different style and for different personalities, and you explained very well why not. Like, so I think it's
Yeah. um, I also like my job because it's something that I can finish on a Friday night and not really think about it on the Saturday, which not
right.
all jobs are. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's terrific. Congrats on your trajectory.
thank you,
And
and on
we'll
yours
have
too.
to back. We'll have to see if this time around the renaissance is is happening.
We'll see.
Let's see. Thank you, Phil. Talk
Thank
to
you
you
so much,
soon.
Leslie. It's
Yeah,
been a
thank
pleasure.
you.
Bye.
This is the Energy Vista podcast. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.